Loretta Johnson was admired across Atlanta, a woman of strength, wisdom, and generosity. But when police forced open the locked attic in her home, everything people thought they knew about her and her son came crashing down. What they uncovered in that dim, dust-choked space would unravel the carefully polished story of family loyalty that Loretta had spent a lifetime building. For decades, Loretta had been the picture of determination. Born in Decatur, Georgia, she came from a family that worked hard just to scrape by. Her father was a factory worker, her mother a seamstress who bent over sewing machines late into the night. Loretta carried their grit with her. By her 20s, she was already known as someone sharp, relentless, and unwilling to be underestimated. Then came love. Anthony Johnson, a truck driver with a good heart but a shaky relationship with money. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was built on loyalty. When Anthony died of a sudden heart attack at just 51, Loretta's world crumbled. Grief pressed heavy on her chest, but out of it came a vow: she would keep her family together. She would give their only child, Darius, a future worth holding on to. And for a while it looked like she succeeded. By her early 50s, Loretta was celebrated in Atlanta's small business community. She wasn't a flashy CEO. She was a mentor, the kind of person who taught barbers how to manage rent, showed food truck owners how to get permits, and guided salon owners through the maze of taxes. She had a gift for breaking down complicated financial advice into plain words. People trusted her. They looked to her like a lighthouse, steady and shining. Her success gave her enough stability to buy a 2-story brick house in East Atlanta. Neighbors often saw her on the porch with a book in hand, waving politely as they passed. The house itself looked like the American dream. Red brick, trimmed hedges, white columns standing tall. It was a home that said, "Here lives a woman who made something of herself." But no one looking at that porch or that house could have guessed the secrets waiting in its attic. Loretta's life wasn't without struggle. Migraines, dizzy spells, and unexplained fatigue began chipping away at her strong exterior. Friends noticed her slowing down, though she insisted it was nothing serious. What they didn't see was how those health issues quietly shifted the balance inside the Johnson home, giving her son Darius more control. Darius Johnson was 33 and, to outsiders, the perfect son. He was tall, smooth-talking, and always by his mother's side. At community events, he introduced himself as Loretta's right-hand man. He carried her bags, shook hands, posed in photos. He looked like the kind of son every mother would want, loyal, protective, honoring his father's dying wish to take care of her. But appearances can lie. And sometimes, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell about ourselves. Behind closed doors, the Johnson home sounded very different. Neighbors would later describe nights when Loretta's soft, weary voice tried to calm Darius down. His voice rose, sharp and commanding, filling the quiet suburban air. One neighbor said it best: "It wasn't the kind of argument you expect between a mother and son. It sounded desperate, like she was begging and he was in control." Still, Loretta defended him fiercely. When friends questioned why Darius didn't have steady work, she waved it off. "He's figuring things out." When neighbors hinted at the arguments, she dismissed them with a tired smile. Love for her son blinded her. She could not imagine, or refused to imagine, what others began to suspect. And yet, upstairs, that attic sat like a silent witness. Darius was often seen carrying boxes up the narrow staircase late at night. No one thought much of it then. Maybe he was storing seasonal clothes or business records. But in hindsight, those trips up the attic stairs were the first cracks in the perfect facade. Loretta's public image, mentor, business guru, homeowner, mother, became a shield that hid the truth. To her community, she was untouchable, too smart, too disciplined to ever lose control of her own household. But even the strongest people can be broken from within. And when betrayal comes from your own blood, it doesn't always announce itself with violence at first. Sometimes it starts with control. Sometimes it starts with lies. And sometimes the truth waits in an attic, locked away, until someone is brave enough to force the door open. This is where I need to pause and remind you, the danger in Loretta's story isn't unique. The biggest threat doesn't always come from strangers in the dark. More often it's the people closest to us, the ones who smile in public and shout behind closed doors. If this happened in your own family, would you be prepared to see the signs? Don't take that risk. Subscribe now, because the stories I share might one day save you or someone you love. Still, Loretta pressed on, working, mentoring, defending her son, keeping up appearances. She told herself that family loyalty mattered above all. She believed Darius when he promised again and again that he was taking care of her. But a promise can be a mask. And once that mask cracks, what's underneath can change everything. And for those of you still thinking you don't need to subscribe, I'll say this. Maybe you're right. Maybe you think betrayal like this could never happen in your home. But if you're wrong, if you're ignoring the possibility, then write it in the comments. Tell us why you're willing to look away. Because silence is exactly what lets stories like Loretta's repeat themselves. From the outside, the Johnsons looked like a model family. A hard-working mother, a devoted son, a home filled with success and sacrifice. But behind the red brick walls and beneath the polished smiles, shadows were moving. And soon, those shadows would crawl out of the attic and into the light. On the outside, Loretta Johnson's life looked like a success story. She was a woman who had climbed out of poverty and built a career by helping others do the same. People admired her confidence. They admired her discipline. They admired her home, her work, her way of walking into a room like she already knew the answer to your question. But what no one realized was that Loretta's success came with a cost. And that cost was being quietly collected inside her own house. Loretta's consulting business had grown steadily since the early 2000s. She hosted workshops in community centers, churches, and rented halls. Barbers, hairstylists, and food truck owners lined up to hear her speak. She was known for her sharp one-liners, the kind that cut through excuses. One client once said, "Loretta could look at your books and in 5 minutes tell you why you weren't making money." By 2016, she was running events every month, becoming something like a celebrity in Atlanta's small business world. People often drove across the city just to hear her advice. And every time she stood at a podium, Darius was nearby, smiling, shaking hands, playing the part of the faithful son. To the audience it looked perfect. A mother and son working together, keeping their family strong after the loss of Anthony. But while Loretta was climbing, her body was breaking down. Migraines, dizzy spells, and unexplained weakness crept into her life. In 2019, she was hospitalized after fainting during a meeting. Doctors couldn't give her a clear answer. Stress, they said. Maybe exhaustion. Loretta laughed it off, telling friends she just needed rest. What no one knew was how often she leaned on Darius in those moments, how he handled her appointments, her calls, her finances. And here's the bitter truth. When weakness enters, control shifts. Slowly, almost invisibly, Loretta went from being the provider to being dependent. And Darius, the son who had promised to take care of her, began to act less like a helper and more like a gatekeeper. By 2020, the pandemic had forced Loretta's business online. She hated the change. She missed seeing faces, shaking hands, feeling the room light up when she spoke. Darius told her not to worry, that he would manage things for her. He set up online payments, answered her messages, even started speaking on her behalf to some clients. From the outside it looked like devotion. Inside it looked like control. Some friends noticed a difference. Loretta seemed harder to reach. Calls went unanswered. Messages took days to be returned. When she did pick up, her voice sounded faint, distracted. "She's slowing down," Darius explained to anyone who asked. "She just needs rest." But rest doesn't explain why her once vibrant energy seemed to vanish. Rest doesn't explain why neighbors began to notice arguments inside the Johnson home. Arguments where Loretta's voice was shaky and pleading, while Darius's voice thundered above hers. One neighbor remembered standing outside on her porch one night, frozen by the sound. She said, "It wasn't just yelling. It was like Loretta was trying to hold him back and he was already 2 steps ahead." And upstairs, that attic door stayed closed. People noticed Darius carrying boxes up there late at night. Not once. Not twice. Many times. What was he storing in that locked space? At the time, no one asked. Now it's impossible not to. Because here's the part no one likes to think about. Sometimes the danger isn't outside your home. It's walking the same hallways you are. It's the voice you hear every day. And if you think you're immune to that kind of betrayal, you're fooling yourself. Subscribe now, because the stories I'm telling you are not fairy tales. They are warnings. The next one could be yours. Loretta's decline grew more obvious in 2021. She bought an insurance policy, something friends later said was unusual. She had always prided herself on handling money herself, but this policy was purchased at Darius's suggestion. He called it planning for the future. But whose future was he really planning? By 2022, Loretta was almost unrecognizable to those who had once leaned on her for guidance. Her strong voice had turned into a faint whisper. Her sharp advice slowed to pauses and sighs. Friends whispered about illness, maybe cancer, maybe something else. But no diagnosis was ever shared. The strange part? Loretta stopped showing up at events entirely. Her house, once a hub of activity, seemed quieter, except for those late-night trips Darius made into the attic. Some neighbors said they saw him carrying boxes that looked heavy. Others swore they heard faint noises from above the ceiling, like something being dragged across the floorboards. But nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to believe something could be wrong in Loretta Johnson's house. And that silence, that refusal to ask questions, is what allowed things to get worse. If you're still watching this and still not subscribing, let me be blunt. You are part of the silence. And silence is how stories like Loretta's keep repeating. If you think this couldn't happen to you, tell us in the comments why you'd risk ignoring danger that's already knocking at someone's attic door. By late 2022, whispers spread. People noticed Loretta's absence. They noticed Darius's explanations that she was just slowing down. They noticed the tension when Terrence Walker, a face from Darius's past, began showing up again at the Johnson house. But Terrence's return, and the storm he would bring, comes later. For now, the cracks in Loretta's perfect image were deepening. The neighbors saw signs. The friends heard excuses. And through it all, Darius kept smiling in public while locking doors in private. The attic wasn't just a storage space. It was a vault of secrets. And the day would come when those secrets couldn't stay hidden anymore. To the outside world, Darius Johnson was a loyal son. The kind of man who honored his father's dying wish and stood by his mother through thick and thin. People saw him carrying groceries, opening doors, standing tall beside Loretta at events. In photos he was always there, smiling just enough to look like a protector. He had perfected the performance of devotion. But behind closed doors the performance cracked. Neighbors who lived close to the Johnsons described nights when the calm of the neighborhood was shattered by shouting. At first they brushed it off. Families argue after all. But these weren't ordinary family arguments. They carried a sharp edge, a desperation that made people stop what they were doing and just listen. One neighbor remembered hearing Loretta's voice late one night. She wasn't yelling back, she was pleading. Her words were muffled by the walls, but the tone was clear. A mother begging for peace, trying to calm down her son. Then came Darius's voice, louder, forceful, cutting through the night like a blade. The neighbor said, it didn't sound like a son talking to his mother. It sounded like someone holding power over her. Yet the next morning, Loretta would step out onto her porch with a wave and a smile. She brushed off questions from friends saying, he's just under stress. He'll be fine. She defended Darius at every turn, as if protecting his reputation was more important than protecting herself. That was her blind spot, the kind of love only a mother could have, the kind that can turn into denial. But while Loretta defended her son, Darius was making moves that went beyond words. Slowly he began to take control of her finances. At first it looked like help. He answered her calls, sorted through her mail, even ran errands to the bank. But those errands weren't just errands, they were steps toward control. In 2021, Loretta purchased an insurance policy. Friends who knew her well thought it was unusual. She had always been careful with money, but she also believed in independence. Why would she suddenly agree to something so heavy, so final? The answer came from Darius. He had been the one to suggest it, insisting it was planning for the future. But whose future was really being planned? Loretta's or his? When investigators later pieced together the timeline, this policy became a red flag. At the time, though, no one questioned it. Loretta had always been smart about money, and if she agreed, surely it was the right thing to do. That was the assumption. But assumptions can be deadly. By 2022, Loretta's public presence had all but vanished. The woman who once spoke to crowded rooms now skipped events. Clients who had relied on her advice said she was suddenly unavailable. Calls went unanswered. When she did pick up, her voice was weak, almost unfamiliar. Darius explained it away. She's slowing down, he told people. She's tired. The pandemic, her health, her age, he had excuses for everything. And people believed him because he said it with such confidence, and because Loretta never contradicted him. But whispers grew. Friends wondered why she was absent. Neighbors wondered why her once busy house seemed quieter, except for those odd late-night trips into the attic. A few started to ask questions. But Loretta's silence and Darius's charm kept the truth buried. This is the part of the story that should make every viewer stop and think. Control doesn't always start with violence. It can start with a smile, with an offer to help, with a son saying, "Let me take care of that for you." And by the time you realize what's really happening, it's already too late. If you think you're safe just because the danger doesn't look obvious, you're lying to yourself. Don't make that mistake. Subscribe now, because knowing how these stories unfold might be the only warning you ever get. Loretta's reputation as a mentor created a kind of shield around her family. People admired her too much to believe something could be wrong. She was too smart, too disciplined, too successful to let her life slip into chaos. But that was the lie everyone told themselves. The same lie Loretta clung to as she defended her son over and over again. Inside her own home, the cracks were spreading. Darius had control over her finances, control over her schedule, even control over what people outside knew about her. And Loretta, worn down by illness and blinded by love, let it happen. The perfect son, the man everyone praised, was building something much darker behind closed doors. And if you're still not convinced that betrayal can come from the people closest to you, then I'll ask you this. Why are you so comfortable ignoring the possibility? If you refuse to subscribe, at least explain it in the comments. Because silence is what lets people like Darius keep winning. By the end of 2022, Loretta was nearly invisible to the outside world. Friends whispered about her absence. Neighbors whispered about the fights. Everyone noticed something was wrong, but no one had proof. The perfect son still smiled in public, and the perfect mother still defended him in private. But perfection never lasts. And soon, someone from Darius's past would return, shaking the fragile foundation he had built. His name was Terrence Walker. And his presence would turn whispers into suspicion, and suspicion into a storm. In early 2023, a new figure entered the Johnson home. One who would unravel the fragile balance that Loretta and Darius had been living under. His name was Terrence Walker. Terrence had grown up alongside Darius. They weren't just classmates, they had once been inseparable. The kind of boys who shared secrets, got into trouble together, and saw each other as brothers. But that bond shattered in their 20s, when Terrence was arrested and sentenced to nearly a decade in prison for burglary. While Darius drifted through odd hustles and half-finished ventures, Terrence spent his 30s behind bars. When he walked free again, he was no longer the same young man. Prison had carved deep lines into his face and a roughness into his manner. But it had also given him a determination to start over. And in the strange way life sometimes works, he found himself reconnecting with Loretta Johnson. Loretta saw something in Terrence that others didn't. Where most people only saw an ex-con, she saw a man trying to rebuild. Compassion had always been her strongest trait. She believed in giving people second chances, just as she had once given herself one after Anthony's death. So when Terrence came to her for advice, nervous, ashamed but eager, she welcomed him. Neighbors soon noticed Terrence's car parked outside the Johnson home. At first, it was during the day, quick visits to talk through job options or money management. But soon, his visits stretched into the evening. Sometimes he was there late at night. To Loretta, this was nothing unusual. She had always opened her door to people in need. She had mentored countless men and women through financial struggles. But this time it was different. Terrence wasn't just a client. He was a man from Darius's past, and that made his presence inside the Johnson house dangerous. Darius did not like it. He saw Terrence as an intruder, a threat, maybe even a rival for his mother's trust. And the tension between them was impossible to ignore. More than once, neighbors saw the two men on the front porch, voices raised, faces inches apart. Terrence's rough tone clashed with Darius's sharp arrogance. Doors slammed. Tempers flared. No one knew exactly what they were arguing about. But the sight of Loretta standing behind them, looking small and tired, told the story. She was caught in the middle, between a son tightening his grip and an old friend trying to push his way in. And this is where the story takes on a chilling irony. Because while Terrence's presence unsettled Darius, it also gave Loretta something she had been missing. A listener. Someone she could confide in. Someone outside the walls of her home. Later, it would come to light that Loretta shared her deepest fears with Terrence. Whispers of control, suspicions about her health, worries about her son's intentions. But at the time, no one knew that. All the community saw was a strange triangle forming. Loretta, the respected matriarch, Darius, the protective son with a temper, and Terrence, the ex-convict whose motives no one could quite pin down. And here's the hard truth. When new people enter fragile situations, they don't just add to the story, they change it. Sometimes they're the key to saving someone. Sometimes they become part of the danger. And if you don't know which role someone plays, you're gambling with lives. If this were your mother, your home, would you want to wait until it's too late to find out? Don't put yourself in that position. Subscribe now, because stories like this are warnings, and ignoring them could cost more than you realize. By the summer of 2023, the arguments between Darius and Terrence grew more heated. Loretta, once a vibrant force in the community, had nearly disappeared from public view. Calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. People who depended on her began to worry. And through it all, Terrence kept showing up. Some neighbors whispered that he might be taking advantage of Loretta's kindness. Others thought he was trying to protect her. Nobody knew for sure. But everyone could see that his presence shook Darius, and not in a good way. On one August evening, a neighbor described hearing a fight that spilled out onto the porch. Voices rose, curses flew, and then came silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than shouting. The neighbor said she froze at her window, watching the two men glare at each other, fists clenched, Loretta standing between them. That image stuck in her mind, a mother trying to keep the peace between a son and an old friend, both of whom carried secrets. Looking back, it's easy to wonder, was Terrence really there to help? Or was he keeping close to protect himself? His history, his timing, his closeness to Loretta, all of it raised questions that investigators would later struggle to answer. But one thing is certain, Terrence's return destabilized everything. The cracks in the Johnson family were no longer just whispers. They were arguments on the porch, missing calls, unanswered questions, and late-night visits. And if you think for one second that people like Loretta, smart, respected, admired, can't fall into dangerous traps, then you're blind to reality. Danger doesn't care how successful you are. It doesn't care how loved you are in your community. It can come quietly, through the people you let closest to you. If you still think you don't need to subscribe, then explain in the comments why you'd gamble with the truth. Because silence is dangerous, and excuses are what predators count on. By late summer, Loretta was a ghost of her former self. Terrence was a constant presence. Darius was growing more defensive, more controlling, more volatile. The stage was set for something to break. And when it did, the fallout would not just expose family secrets. It would drag the entire community into a story darker than anyone could imagine. By the start of 2023, the absence of Loretta Johnson had become impossible to ignore. For years, she had been a fixture in Atlanta's business community. If you were trying to start a barbershop, open a food truck, or manage a small salon, you knew her name. People counted on her advice, and she rarely disappointed them. She was the kind of woman who showed up, who delivered, who made things happen. But now, the woman who once filled auditoriums with her energy was vanishing. It started small. A missed call here. A rescheduled workshop there. She apologized politely, said she was under the weather, or taking time to rest. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, Loretta had worked hard for decades. Maybe she deserved a break. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern became alarming. Calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. Friends said that when she did pick up the phone, her voice no longer sounded like hers. Once sharp and full of authority, now it was faint, trembling, distracted. She sounded so tired, one longtime client recalled. I kept thinking, this isn't Loretta. Something's wrong. And while Loretta was slipping away, Darius was stepping in. He told friends, clients, and neighbors that his mother was simply slowing down with age. He reassured everyone that she was fine, that he was taking care of things. He was calm, convincing, even charming. But charm can be a mask. And calmness can hide something much darker. By the summer, whispers spread through the community. People missed her at events. They noticed Darius was handling her affairs more often. And they wondered why Loretta, a woman who thrived on connection, was suddenly so distant. Angela Morris, one of her closest clients, recalled the breaking point. Loretta had promised to attend a seminar. She had never been the type to cancel without warning. But that day came and went, and Loretta never showed. Angela tried to call, text, even drive by the house. No answer. That's when she said the words that many others had been too afraid to speak. Something isn't right. Angela wasn't alone. Others began to notice signs that Loretta wasn't just resting. She was disappearing. By August 2023, Angela called the Atlanta Police Department for a wellness check. Officers arrived at the Johnson home one evening. Darius answered the door with his trademark smile. He was calm, cooperative, even welcoming. He explained that his mother was simply under the weather and needed rest. He assured the officers that she was safe and well cared for. But Loretta never came to the door. The officers left after a short conversation, finding no immediate cause for alarm. On paper, the situation looked normal. A grown son taking care of his mother. A respected woman resting at home. Nothing that demanded further action. But this is where the danger hides. Family loyalty can be a smokescreen. Neighbors didn't want to accuse Darius of wrongdoing. Friends didn't want to believe Loretta was in trouble. And the police had no proof. Everyone told themselves it was fine, that the son was simply doing what sons are supposed to do. And that's the life lesson buried in Loretta's story. Too often we assume loyalty means safety. We believe that because someone is family they must be trustworthy. But trust can blind us. And blind spots are where abuse thrives. If you think love and loyalty are enough to protect you, you're lying to yourself. Don't make that mistake. Subscribe now, because the only way to see the signs is to know how they look when they first appear. By the fall of 2023, Loretta was almost completely cut off. Friends who had once seen her weekly hadn't laid eyes on her in months. Clients who depended on her guidance were left adrift. The vibrant, unstoppable woman was now a rumor, a voice fading into silence. And all the while Darius kept smiling. He stood on the porch with polite excuses. He told anyone who asked that his mother was slowing down, that she just needed time to rest. And people believed him because believing the lie was easier than facing the truth. But here's the part that should unsettle you. If everyone around you chose silence, would anyone notice if you started fading away? If you think your community would always protect you, then explain in the comments why you're so sure. Because silence isn't protection. Silence is permission. And permission is exactly what people like Darius count on. The first wellness check came and went without answers. Loretta's absence deepened. And the whispers grew louder. Someone had to break the silence. Someone had to force the truth into the open. That someone would be Terrence Walker. And when he finally made the call that changed everything, the Johnson home, and its attic, would become the center of a nightmare. By the end of 2023, the whispers about Loretta Johnson had turned into open concern. She was no longer just absent from the community, she seemed to have vanished. Friends spoke about her in past tense as if she were already gone. But one man refused to stay quiet. That man was Terrence Walker. Terrence had been around the Johnson house more than most. He had seen Loretta up close when others hadn't. And what he saw left him shaken. She wasn't the same woman, he later told investigators. Her eyes looked tired. Her face was pale. She was so thin I barely recognized her. Neighbors who caught rare glimpses agreed. They described Loretta as frail, hunched, moving slowly. Some said she looked a decade older than her 61 years. Others whispered that she must have been battling a serious illness. But no diagnosis was ever mentioned. The only explanation came from Darius. She's just getting older. She needs rest. But Terrence didn't buy it. He knew Loretta too well. He knew her strength, her energy, her fire. And what he saw now wasn't just aging. It was something darker. Something controlled. On December 2, 2023, Terrence made the call that changed everything. He dialed the Atlanta Police Department with a voice filled with urgency. The dispatcher recorded every word. "I don't think Miss Loretta's okay," Terrence said. "He's hiding something in that house. You need to check the attic." The attic. That one word was enough to jolt officers into action. Because attics aren't just storage spaces. They're places where secrets can be buried out of sight. That night, officers returned to the Johnson home. The house looked calm, almost staged in its stillness. Christmas decorations lined the porch. Lights glowed softly from the windows. It looked ordinary, safe, even warm. But when Darius opened the door, his smile seemed too polished. He greeted the officers like old friends, polite and cooperative. He insisted his mother was fine, that she was simply resting upstairs and didn't want to be disturbed. He told them they had nothing to worry about. And here's where you need to stop and think. How many times do we take politeness as proof of innocence? How often do we let a smile convince us that everything is okay? That kind of thinking is dangerous. Don't let yourself fall into it. Subscribe now, because the only way to protect yourself is to see past the surface, to recognize the masks people wear. The officers asked to look around the house. Darius agreed without hesitation. He led them through the living room, the dining area, the kitchen. Everything was neat, orderly, almost spotless. Upstairs, the bedrooms were tidy, the beds made. But Loretta was nowhere to be found. The officers pressed again. Where was his mother? Darius repeated the same story. She was resting at a friend's house and she didn't want to be disturbed. His voice was steady. His tone was confident. But his eyes flickered with something else. And when the subject of the attic came up, his composure cracked. The attic door was locked. That alone raised questions. Most homes in the neighborhood left attic doors unlatched, used only for storage. But here the lock stood out like a warning. When the officers asked for the key, Darius hesitated. Just a pause, just a beat too long, but enough to shift suspicion. He claimed he had misplaced it, fumbling for words, his smooth demeanor faltering for the first time. And that hesitation became the moment investigators would later call the crystallization of suspicion. Because hesitation tells a story. Hesitation means doubt. Hesitation means there's something behind that locked door you don't want people to see. Think about your own life. If police showed up at your house right now and asked to see every room, could you open every door without flinching? If your answer is no, then ask yourself, what are you hiding? And if you still won't subscribe after hearing this, at least explain it in the comments. Maybe your reason will help others understand why people stay silent when they should be speaking out. That December night, the officers didn't walk away. They pressed harder. They insisted on getting into the attic. And with each question, Darius's hesitation grew. His charm and politeness could no longer mask the truth. The locked door was about to be broken open, and what waited on the other side would shatter the image of the loyal son forever. The night of December 2nd, 2023, the Johnson home shifted from a place of calm lies to a crime scene. The moment Darius hesitated about the attic key, suspicion hardened into action. The officers didn't leave. They made a decision that would unravel the story of Loretta Johnson piece by piece. They broke the lock. The sound of splintering would echo through the quiet house. Darius stood nearby, his polite mask cracking into silence. Behind that locked door lay the truth he had worked so hard to hide. The attic air was stale, heavy with dust that drifted like fog when the officers pushed their way inside. Their flashlights swept across the room, revealing stacks of boxes piled with careful precision. Furniture sat beneath yellowing sheets, the outlines of chairs and tables like ghosts frozen in time. Cobwebs stretched from beam to beam, disturbed only by the sudden presence of strangers. At first glance, nothing seemed extraordinary. It looked like an ordinary attic filled with storage and clutter. But the longer the officers looked, the clearer it became. This space wasn't abandoned. It was curated, organized, controlled. One officer pulled open the first box. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, all addressed to Loretta. Bank statements, insurance notices, letters from clients. Every one of them unopened. Every one of them intercepted. The boxes told a story of silence. Letters that should have been in Loretta's hands had been hidden here, tucked away out of sight. Another officer opened a second box. Inside were financial ledgers. Some pages were in Loretta's handwriting, steady and neat. Others had been altered, numbers crossed out, figures rewritten in another hand. Investigators would later note that the ledgers revealed discrepancies. Legitimate income missing, large withdrawals timed to Loretta's weakest moments. But the most chilling discovery came from a trunk shoved against the far wall. Heavy, locked, its surface coated in dust. When they pried it open, what they found silenced the room. Inside were notebooks and cassette tapes. The notebooks were Loretta's. The handwriting, shaky but deliberate, stretched across years. And in those pages, she told a story no one wanted to believe. She wrote about Darius tampering with her medication, preparing tea that made her weaker instead of stronger. She described waking up disoriented, unable to remember conversations. She detailed unexplained withdrawals from her accounts, money vanishing while she was too ill to act. She confessed her growing fear that her son, the man she trusted most, was isolating her from the world. One entry read, He says he's protecting me, but my body tells me otherwise. I feel weaker when he prepares my tea. If anything happens, someone must look to him." Her words turned the attic from a storage room into a vault of betrayal. The journals transformed suspicion into horror. Loretta's voice, written in ink, cut through the lies Darius had told for years. And here is the part you need to hear clearly. Abuse doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers from behind closed doors, hidden in diaries no one sees until it's too late. If you think this couldn't happen in your family, you are dangerously wrong. Subscribe now, because ignoring these stories won't protect you. It will only blind you. The officers turned page after page, their flashlights illuminating Loretta's private torment. She wrote of being watched, of being silenced, of feeling like a prisoner in her own home. She wrote about the fear of scandal, of shame, of losing her son's love. And still, she left a trail, a record of warnings that now screamed from the attic. The cassettes only deepened the unease. On some, Loretta's voice trembled as she spoke her thoughts aloud, capturing the fear she hadn't dared share publicly. On others, muffled sounds hinted at arguments, sharp voices cutting through static. The attic had become both a hiding place and a confession chamber. Every box, every letter, every page pulled Darius's mask apart. Think about that. For years, Loretta's neighbors saw a strong woman and a devoted son. Her friends saw loyalty. Her clients saw wisdom. But all along, upstairs, the truth was being boxed, hidden, silenced. And if you're sitting there thinking you'd never missed the signs in your own life, prove it. If you won't subscribe, then at least comment why you'd risk closing your eyes. Because silence and denial are exactly what make predators thrive. By the time the officers finished searching the attic that night, they had more than suspicion. They had evidence. Evidence of financial exploitation. Evidence of coercion. Evidence that Loretta herself feared her son. But the attic held more than proof. It held questions. Where was Loretta? Was she alive? If she had written so clearly about her fear, why hadn't she escaped? And why had Darius chosen the attic, a place so visible yet so secretive, to hide it all? The attic door had been forced open, but the answers were just beginning to spill out. And as investigators dug deeper into the trunk of Loretta's life, one thing became clear. She had been leaving behind a silent cry for help. And soon, Terrence Walker would step forward with a revelation that made the case even more tangled. A revelation that would force everyone to ask, was he trying to save her or save himself? Among the notebooks pulled from the attic trunk, one entry stood out above the rest. It was dated April 14, 2022, written in Loretta's shaky handwriting, the ink smudged as if her hand had trembled while she wrote. Darius insists he is protecting me, but my body tells me otherwise. I feel weaker when he prepares my tea. If anything happens, someone must look to him. Those words froze investigators. They weren't speculation. They weren't rumors. They were a direct accusation, from a mother against her own son. Imagine writing that about the child you raised, the child you defended, the child you trusted more than anyone else in the world. Loretta's words weren't just notes. They were a warning. A desperate attempt to leave behind proof in case she never had the chance to speak for herself. But the attic wasn't the only place Loretta had left a trail. As detectives dug deeper, Terrence Walker came forward with a revelation. He admitted that months earlier, Loretta had given him a sealed envelope. She told him not to open it. She told him to keep it safe, and to hand it to authorities if anything ever happened to her. Terrence said he didn't fully understand why, but the urgency in her voice made him agree. When investigators opened the envelope, its contents hit like a thunderclap. Inside was a copy of Loretta's insurance policy. The sole beneficiary listed was her son, Darius Johnson. The meaning was clear. Loretta knew the stakes. She suspected her son wasn't caring for her out of love. She feared he was waiting for her to die, and perhaps even hastening that outcome. The envelope was a time bomb she had planted in Terrence's hands. And when it finally went off, it confirmed the darkest suspicions about Darius. But the revelation also raised uncomfortable questions. Why Terrence? Why trust a man with a criminal record, someone her son despised, someone the community had reason to doubt? Was Terrence really her confidant, or was he using her fear to his own advantage? Detectives struggled with that question. On one hand, Terrence had stepped forward, his tip about the attic opening the door to truth. On the other hand, his sudden closeness to Loretta, his late-night visits, and his silence until the situation reached a breaking point made him look suspicious too. It was the perfect twist. The man who seemed like a whistleblower might also be a suspect. And here is the part that should hit you hardest. Loretta didn't trust her community, her friends, or even the police with her secret. She trusted a man with a history of burglary because she felt she had no one else. If you think isolation could never happen to you or someone you love, you're ignoring reality. Subscribe now, because recognizing these patterns might be the only way to protect yourself when loyalty and love blind you. The deeper investigators looked, the more Loretta's journals painted a picture of a woman trapped in her own home. She wrote of being cut off from friends, of money vanishing, of her health failing at suspicious times. She wrote of shame, of not wanting the community to see her weakness. And woven through it all was her devotion to Darius. The devotion that made her hesitate to expose him fully, even as she left behind clues. Terrence's role only thickened the mystery. Was he truly trying to save Loretta? Or was he motivated by guilt, by self-preservation, by some hidden deal with Darius? The police didn't have answers yet. All they knew was that Loretta had placed a dangerous kind of trust in him, just as she had placed too much trust in her son. And if you're watching this thinking you'd never fall into the same trap, let me be blunt. You're fooling yourself. Abuse doesn't start with violence. It starts with trust. It starts with believing someone when they say, "I'm protecting you." If you refuse to subscribe after hearing Loretta's cry for help, at least comment why. Because your silence is no different than the silence that kept Loretta trapped. By the time investigators finished piecing together the attic evidence, they had enough to see the outline of a crime. The unopened mail, the altered ledgers, the hidden journals, the sealed envelope, all of it pointed to long-term exploitation. But there was still one haunting question left unanswered. Where was Loretta? The attic gave investigators her words, her warnings, her fear. But it didn't give them her body. It didn't tell them whether she was alive or dead. And that gap between evidence and certainty was enough to keep the case in shadow. Enough to keep Darius smiling in denial. Enough to keep Terrence under suspicion. The attic had revealed Loretta's silent cry. But the house still held deeper horrors waiting to be uncovered. Horrors hidden not in the attic this time, but in the basement, where walls and shadows told an even darker story. The attic had given investigators Loretta's voice, her journals, her warnings, her fears. But the house itself still held more. And when Atlanta detectives conducted a full forensic sweep of the Johnson home, they found the kind of evidence that transforms suspicion into horror. It happened in the basement. At first glance, the basement seemed ordinary. Cement floor, old furniture pushed to the sides, storage boxes stacked neatly. But a detective noticed something strange, a section of drywall that didn't match the rest. The paint was fresher, the seams uneven. It looked like a repair, but it felt more like a cover-up. They knocked on the wall. The sound was hollow. Tools were brought in, and within minutes, a hidden storage area was exposed. What lay inside made even seasoned investigators pause. The space was cramped, dim, suffocating. And inside were objects that spoke louder than words. 2 wheelchairs, one visibly used. And medical supplies including 4 bags, syringes, and bottles of medication. A blanket stained with blood, later confirmed to match Loretta's DNA. A single women's shoe, size 8, the same size Loretta wore. The basement told a story no one wanted to believe. It suggested that Loretta Johnson, the admired matriarch of East Atlanta, may have been confined in her own home. Not cared for. Not protected. Confined. Think about that. The woman who gave her community hope and guidance may have been treated like a prisoner by the son she trusted most. The same son who smiled in public, who promised his father he'd protect her, who told neighbors she was simply resting. Now the truth was bleeding through the walls. When news of the basement discovery spread, the community's reaction was explosive. Neighbors who once praised Darius were stunned. Some were angry, others heartbroken, many simply refused to believe it. Not Darius, one neighbor said. He loved his mother. We all saw it. But what people saw was an illusion. A mask. Behind that mask was a son who may have turned his mother's devotion into her downfall. The anger was not just at Darius but at themselves. How could they have missed the signs? How could they have ignored the arguments, the silence, the strange trips to the attic at night? Guilt rippled through the community. People realized they had trusted too much. assumed too much, stayed quiet when they should have spoken. And here's where the lesson strikes hardest. Abuse doesn't always happen in shadows. Sometimes it happens in broad daylight, disguised as loyalty. And if you think you could never be fooled by someone close to you, think again. Subscribe now, because the stories you refuse to believe are the same ones that will blindside you when it's too late. Detectives who examined the basement said it felt less like storage and more like a holding space. The wheelchairs suggested mobility issues, yet Loretta was never seen in public using one. The medical supplies pointed to care, but care under whose control? The blood-stained blanket and the shoe turned care into confinement, into something darker. It was betrayal in its rawest form. The kind of betrayal that takes what should be love and twists it into control. The discovery also divided the community. Some defended Darius, clinging to the image they knew. Others condemned him, saying the evidence spoke for itself. Still others turned their suspicion toward Terrence Walker, wondering if his sudden closeness to Loretta meant he knew more than he admitted. But the basement didn't lie. It showed the truth in stains and scraps, in silence and shadows. And if you're sitting there thinking, "I'd never let something like this happen in my family," then explain why so many of Loretta's friends said the same thing until it was too late. If you won't subscribe, then comment why you're willing to look away. Because looking away is exactly what allowed Loretta's suffering to remain hidden for so long. The attic had given Loretta a voice. The basement gave her absence a body. Not literally, not yet, but symbolically. The wheelchair, the supplies, the blanket, the shoe. They were pieces of a puzzle pointing to one unbearable conclusion. Loretta had not been living freely in her own home. But if the attic and basement revealed so much, why hadn't they revealed her fate? Where was Loretta? That question still loomed like a shadow over every discovery. And just when investigators thought they had uncovered the worst of it, they realized the house had more to give. The attic wasn't finished speaking. It had one more secret, waiting in a far corner under insulation and dust. That secret would not answer questions. It would only deepen them. A week after the discovery in the basement, investigators returned to the Johnson home. They had already forced open the attic once and uncovered Loretta's journals, her unopened mail, and her fears written in trembling ink. But something about the house still felt unfinished. Too many questions remained unanswered. This time they didn't come alone. They brought cadaver dogs. The air in the attic was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust swirled under flashlight beams, landing on the covered furniture and stacked boxes like a veil. The officers stood silently as the dogs sniffed their way across the space, moving with purpose. And then near the far corner, the dogs froze. They scratched at the floorboards, pawing at a section of insulation that looked no different from the rest. Their handlers leaned down, watching the animals alert to something unseen but undeniable. Investigators pulled back the insulation. Loose boards shifted under their hands. And there, hidden beneath layers of dust and wood, they uncovered a contractor's bag wrapped in duct tape. Heavy. Seal. Wrong. When they cut it open, the contents told a story darker than anything they had imagined. Inside were women's clothes, folded neatly but stained with time. A lock of gray-streaked hair tied with a ribbon. A pair of reading glasses. And a wedding ring engraved with initials that matched Loretta and her late husband Anthony. It was as if someone had collected pieces of Loretta's life and buried them in the attic like relics. Not evidence of death, but evidence of disappearance. Personal items too intimate to explain away, too specific to dismiss. The attic, once seen as just storage, had become a tomb of secrets. The discovery left investigators shaken. They had expected something, maybe paperwork, maybe traces of fraud. But this was different. This was personal. These were the items a woman wears, touches, treasures. Items she would never willingly discard. And yet there was still no body. That was the most haunting detail of all. The attic screamed of Loretta's presence, but her absence was louder. The belongings said she was gone, but they didn't say where. The police could prove exploitation, control, even harm. But without Loretta herself, they were trapped between suspicion and certainty. The community's reaction was immediate. News spread like wildfire across East Atlanta. The woman who had built small businesses, who had mentored so many, had left behind journals of fear, a basement of horror, and an attic of secrets. Her son, once praised as devoted, now stood accused in whispers that grew louder every day. Some still defended him, unwilling to believe a son could do this to his own mother. Others condemned him outright, calling him a monster. But the sharpest pain came from the realization that Loretta herself had seen this coming, and no one had saved her. And this is where I need to stop and tell you something plainly. The exploitation of elders doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like care. Sometimes it looks like devotion. Sometimes it looks like a son carrying groceries or handling bank accounts or smiling on the porch. That's how it hides. That's how it thrives. If you think your family is immune, you're wrong. Subscribe now, because seeing through the mask is the only protection you have. Investigators logged every item from the attic. Each one became a piece of evidence, each one a fragment of a puzzle that still lacked its center. The contractor's bag proved Loretta's story wasn't just about finances. It was about confinement, control, and erasure. But the absence of her body kept the case in limbo. Without it, every piece of evidence was heavy with implication but light on closure. It was like staring at a crime written in fragments with the final chapter torn out. And that is why this case still unsettles people today. Because closure never came. If you're still watching this and refusing to subscribe, let me ask you directly, what would you have done if this was your neighbor? Would you have spoken up sooner? Or would you have stayed silent, just like so many did for Loretta? If silence is your choice, then explain it in the comments. Because silence isn't neutral, it's dangerous. By the end of 2023, investigators had an attic full of journals, belongings, and hidden bags. They had a basement of medical supplies and blood. They had a son who smiled too much and hesitated too long. They had a friend whose motives were murky at best. But they still didn't have Loretta. And that absence, that missing body, turned the Johnson home from a crime scene into a mystery that refused to be solved. The attic had revealed secrets. The basement had revealed horror. And now the entire house stood as a monument to unanswered questions. But the greatest question of all was this: had Darius acted alone? Or was Terrence Walker, the man who claimed to be Loretta's protector, entangled in the darkness too? The answers would carry this case into its final haunting chapter. The attic had revealed Loretta's fears. The basement had revealed her suffering. The contractor's bag had revealed her belongings. And yet, the most important piece was still missing: Loretta Johnson herself. Police searched tirelessly. They combed through the neighborhood, scanned wooded areas, and brought in cadaver dogs to expand the search. But no body was ever found. Loretta seemed to have vanished, not just from her community but from the earth itself. This absence turned the case into something more than a crime. It became a haunting. A question without an answer. A story frozen in suspense. Darius Johnson was, without question, the prime suspect. The attic journals spoke against him. The financial records showed exploitation. The insurance policy, with him as sole beneficiary, cast suspicion like a shadow that never lifted. The basement pointed toward confinement. And yet, without Loretta's body, prosecutors were left staring at a wall of evidence that could suggest but not confirm. Darius maintained his innocence. He insisted his mother was alive, resting elsewhere, refusing to see visitors. He smiled when questioned, denied wrongdoing, and blamed Terrence for stirring up trouble. He clung to his image of devotion, even as the mask cracked around him. But suspicion alone doesn't close a case. And that is where the torment began, not just for investigators but for everyone who loved Loretta. Terrence's role only deepened the confusion. On one hand, he was the reason police checked the attic at all. His tip, his insistence, had unlocked the door. On the other hand, his criminal past and his late-night visits painted him in shades of gray. Had he truly been Loretta's protector? Or had he seen an opportunity to position himself as one while hiding something of his own? Detective Carla Simmons, one of the lead investigators, reflected on the case in her notes. This is a classic example of exploitation masked by loyalty. Loretta Johnson was admired, trusted, and respected. Her son was seen as devoted. But devotion can hide coercion. Communities are often blinded by reputation, unwilling to believe danger can live behind a familiar face. And in that blindness, victims are left alone. Her words cut to the heart of the tragedy. Loretta was surrounded by people, yet she was isolated. She had friends, neighbors, clients, but her silence, and their hesitation, kept the truth buried until it was almost too late. And here's the part you need to face: closure isn't guaranteed. If you think every victim is found, every case is solved, you're wrong. Some vanish forever, leaving behind only fragments of their story. If you don't want to be blindsided by the silence of unanswered questions, subscribe now. Because these stories don't just happen in Atlanta, they can happen anywhere. For Loretta's clients, the loss was more than personal. She had been their guide, their mentor, their hope. Without her, they felt abandoned, adrift. Some blamed themselves for not speaking up sooner. Others blamed Darius, outright calling him a manipulator. Still others turned suspicion toward Terrence, whispering that he knew more than he said. But no matter where they pointed their fingers, the fact remained: Loretta was gone. The tension between evidence and uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone. Darius was never seen as innocent again, but he wasn't proven guilty either. Terrence was never charged, but he was never cleared. The community was left with whispers, half-truths, and a story that refused to close. And that's the torment of this case. Justice feels incomplete without answers. Families can't heal without truth. Communities can't rest without closure. But Loretta's story remains suspended, hanging between suspicion and certainty, devotion and betrayal, presence and absence. And if you're watching this thinking, I couldn't live with questions like that, then understand this: the people around Loretta are still living with them every single day. If you still won't subscribe, then comment why. Tell us why you'd rather look away than face the pain of uncertainty. Because uncertainty is the most dangerous silence of all. By the end of 2023, the Johnson case was less a case and more a riddle. Everyone agreed on one truth: Loretta Johnson had been betrayed. But by whom and to what extent remained unanswered. And that unanswered question, where is Loretta, lingers like a ghost, haunting every corner of her story. The attic revealed her fear. The basement revealed her suffering. The bag revealed her life. But without her body, the truth is still incomplete. And that incompleteness is what makes this story so disturbing. Loretta Johnson's story is more than a crime file. It is more than evidence sealed in boxes, more than ledgers and journals, more than an attic in a basement. Her story is about what it means to live a life of strength, and how even the strongest can be broken by betrayal from within. For decades, Loretta was a pillar in Atlanta's small business community. She lifted others when they had no idea how to lift themselves. She gave advice, lent her time, shared her wisdom, and poured her energy into people who might have otherwise been forgotten. For so many, she wasn't just a consultant. She was a mentor, a guide, a friend. Her home reflected her legacy, a brick house that symbolized hard work and perseverance. To her neighbors, she was a figure of respect. To her friends, she was a voice of reason. To her son, she was everything. And yet, inside that very house, the foundation of her life cracked. The attic showed the world the truth Loretta could never say out loud: that she feared her son, that her health declined under his control, that money was taken when she was too weak to stop it, that love had turned into isolation. The basement added horror to heartbreak. Medical supplies, blood, a shoe, a blanket. Pieces of evidence that suggested she hadn't just been exploited, she may have been confined, hidden, erased. The second attic search deepened the mystery. Her clothes, her glasses, her wedding ring, her hair. Intimate belongings stripped from her life, buried in duct tape and dust. Proof that she was gone, but not proof of where. This is Loretta's legacy. A woman who gave everything to others, and who may have lost everything to the person she trusted most. And here's the lesson buried in her story: resilience is powerful, but blind trust can be fatal. Loretta's love for her son, her unwillingness to expose him, her silence to protect his reputation. Those choices cost her safety. And it's not just her. Too many families are blinded by loyalty, too many communities by reputation. If you think this can't happen in your family, you are wrong. It can. It does. And it will again. Subscribe now, because the only protection against betrayal is awareness, and silence is not protection. For Loretta's friends and clients, the loss was unbearable. They spoke of her as if she were still alive, refusing to let the finality sink in. They organized vigils, shared stories, remembered her laughter, her sharp wit, her tough love advice. But every story carried the weight of what was missing: her. Detective Carla Simmons reflected on it best. Loretta Johnson was celebrated for her strength. But even strength needs protection. Even resilience needs support. She was failed by her son, but also by all of us who didn't see the signs until it was too late. That reflection cuts deep. Because it isn't just about Loretta. It's about every elder's silenced by exploitation. every parent betrayed by a child, every neighbor who chooses not to ask questions. If you're still here, still watching, and still not subscribing, then at least admit it in the comments. Tell us why you're willing to risk staying blind. Because blindness is what allows predators to thrive, and silence is what buries stories like Loretta's before they're ever told. Loretta's legacy is not only in the businesses she built up, or the people she mentored, or the strength she showed. Her legacy is in the lesson her story leaves behind, that danger often hides behind devotion, that betrayal often wears the mask of loyalty, that love can sometimes be the cover for control. Her story ends not with closure, but with a haunting absence. Police found her journals. They found her belongings. They found her blood. But they never found her body. And that is the part of Loretta's story that lingers. What police found in the attic was horrifying. But what they didn't find may be even more unsettling. Loretta's story is a warning, not just about betrayal, but about silence. She left behind journals, belongings, even her blood, but never the peace of closure. If this could happen to a woman as strong and respected as Loretta Johnson, it could happen to anyone you know, even you. Don't walk away thinking you're safe. Subscribe now so you never miss the signs again, because the truth you ignore today could be the tragedy you live tomorrow.